In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains how your temperament can shape your perception in life.
A lot of what people seem to do is, one thing you could think of is that they politicize their temperament by constructing post hoc arguments about the way the world is. But it's deeper than that, you see, because we already know that you have to use filtering mechanisms in order to orient yourself in the world, right? Because the world is just too complicated for you to orient yourself without using filtering mechanisms. And the question is, well, what are the filtering mechanisms? And to a large degree, they're your temperamental proclivities, because they set up your value structure, for example, and that sets up your perceptual frame. And so what that means is that you screen the world at the level of the facts that display themselves to you. Because, you know, you could say, well, you're a dispassionate observer of the universe of facts, and that you extract out the conclusions that a reasonable person would extract out from that body of facts. But unfortunately, that's not the case, because your perceptions are biased by your temperament. And they have to be because you have to screen things. And so you screen things in accordance with your temperament. You know, you're oriented towards certain things in the world, certain values, for example. And that's perfectly reasonable, because you can't do everything at once anyways. So there's no reason for you not to be directional. The question is, what are the pathologies associated with directionality? Now, conscientiousness is a very interesting trait in relationship to that, because there are obvious benefits to being conscientious, right? I mean, it's the best long-term predictor of job performance, for example, and I'll outline some other data. That might be more associated with industriousness than orderliness, but there's utility to orderliness as well, and we'll cover that in detail today. The question is, the issue is that you never get a benefit without a price. And so you can see that with agreeableness. If you're agreeable, high in agreeableness, then you're compassionate and polite, and you're empathic, and you can work well in teams. But the price you pay for that is that you don't negotiate very well on your own behalf, and that you can be easily taken advantage of. And then if you're very low in agreeableness, well, then you're more competitive and more out to win, I would say. But the price you pay for that is that if you become too disagreeable, then you're likely to be sufficiently antisocial, let's say, so that you might end up in prison. So you don't get a cost without a benefit. You don't get a benefit without a cost. So then the question might be, well, what's up with conscientiousness? Because it seems, all things considered, that it would be a good thing to be conscientious. Now, I can think of some exceptions to that. So conscientious people are dutiful, industrious, orderly, that sort of thing. And they tend to sacrifice the present for the future. And that's a good thing. So you save up, let's say you save up wealth, you save up labor and effort for the future. You know, don't live for today, don't be impulsive, work hard, and all that. That'll accrue you success over the long run. The downside of that is the long run has to be stable in order for that to be a reasonable strategy. And so conscientiousness is not a good strategy, at least under some conditions, in situations that are radically unstable. Because in situations that are radically unstable, you might as well get what you can now, or that's one way of looking at it anyways. The other thing about being conscientious, if you store up wealth, say, as a consequence of hard work, then that can make you targets for people who would like to come and take your wealth. And so it's also one of the things that happened to many people in the 20th century, most recently in Venezuela, is that, let's say you're conscientious and you save money. Well, what happens in a period of hyperinflation? Well, your money's wiped out. And so, you know, this happened to Germany, say, in the 1920s. And you got to understand what hyperinflation does to a society, because what hyperinflation does is destroy the people who worked hardest to construct the society, because they're the people who've been prudent and careful and sacrificed and so forth. And then when a period of high inflation comes along, poof, everything they have disappears. And that happened in Germany during the 1920s. Now, there was a bunch of reasons for that, but so Germany was very unstable in the 1920s, right? Because of the war had just ended. They had been subjected to the Versailles Treaty, which was a very punitive treaty aimed against Germany. It's not like the Allies had lacked reasons to impose a punitive treaty, but nonetheless, they did. Germany lost a lot of territory, including their industrial areas. Germany was flooded by men who were brutalized in the trenches in World War I. I mean, you could hardly imagine how terrible trench warfare is, and you can't imagine what you'd be like after a month of that, a day of that, let alone a couple of years of that. And then Germany underwent a period of hyperinflation. At the same time, in the Soviet Union, the communist revolution had been successful. And so there was tremendous political upheaval in Germany during the 1920s as well. I want to just set the stage for that. And so, but the hyperinflation wiped out all the people that were prudent and saved and left them with a terrible sense that the entire system had betrayed them, which is of course exactly what had happened. Conscientiousness is a bit of a mystery. You know, we've looked at plasticity, right? And already. That's a combination of extroversion and openness. I just want to walk you through again where conscientiousness is located in the big five space. So plasticity is a combination of extroversion and openness. And then stability is a combination of conscientiousness, emotional stability, and agreeableness. And conscientiousness is made out of industriousness and orderliness. Now here's some markers for conscientiousness. So here's what you're like if you're orderly or if you're industrious. You carry out your plans. You don't waste time. You don't find it difficult to get down to work. You don't mess things up. You finish what you start. You put your mind on the task at hand. You get things done quickly. You know what you're doing. You don't postpone decisions, and you're not easily distracted. That's what an industrious person is like. We don't know anything about industrious people. We cannot figure out why they're industrious. If you read the neuropsychological literature, you might assume that people who have highly functioning prefrontal cortexes might be more conscientious, because people associate the prefrontal cortex with such things as the capacity to plan. The problem with that is that we've, for example, tested now thousands of people using tests of dorsolateral prefrontal cognitive ability, which are basically cognitive tests. And as you know from being in this class, if you take a battery of cognitive tests and you subject them to a factor analysis, you can extract out a first factor, and that's fluid intelligence. And the correlation between fluid intelligence and conscientiousness is 0. Right, so that's very, very strange, because you would tend to think that people who were smarter might be better at planning, and maybe they are, but they're not necessarily better at implementing. And and we don't understand the difference between planning and implementation. We don't know what that is. You got to think about it this way too, though. Just because you're better at planning wouldn't necessarily imply that you're better at implementing, because actually one of the prerequisites for thinking abstractly is that you can detach your plans from your action, right? Because otherwise you just automatically act out everything you planned. But that isn't what people do. They separate out their thinking so that they can work in an abstract space that's divorced from their action, and so they can lay out multiple plans without necessarily acting them out. But then that introduces the additional complication of having to implement, and industrious people seem to be good at implementation. But we don't know why. We've done all sorts of laboratory studies trying to see if we could get some sort of laboratory task that industrious people would do better in the lab than non-industrious people. God, you'd think that would be a snap. We probably tested 50 things and have never got anything. Differences in language use is as close as we've got. You can extract out estimates of people's conscientiousness or their industriousness from the way they use language, but that's not a lot different than using self-report personality scales. It's different, but it's not a lot different.